go. And I will light our chalice this evening in gratitude for our ability to gather and be involved in our democracy. May the light of this chalice always remind us to work for justice centered in love. So it is my honor to introduce Peter Bolland, who most of you are familiar with. Peter is the Philosophy and Humanities Department Chair at Southwestern College, where he teaches world religions, Asian philosophy, world mythology, and ethics. He also writes a column for Unity Magazine and is the author of the book, The Seven Stone Path, An Everyday Journey to Wisdom. He's a frequent guest speaker at many religious and spiritual communities, including Unitarian, New Thought, and other progressive churches. He also offers in-person and online workshops around the country on the many ways the insights from the world's religious traditions enhance and enrich our everyday lives. His blog, YouTube channel, and online guided meditations attract a worldwide following, and you can learn more about them at peterbolland.com. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful. It is such a thrill. Thank you, Tony, for that introduction. And I appreciate the mention of the book. That's nice. I'm that book author guy on Zoom who has my book in the frame. And even though you can't really see it, it's a book-shaped thing there behind me. So I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing in a moment, but I just wanted to say hello to everyone and thank you very much for joining us. Today's presentation is called Inside the Electoral College, and I have basically two goals for our time together. And one is, let's take whatever we already know about the Electoral College and expand it and fill out the picture so that maybe we come out of this with a little more clarity about its origin and the rationale for it being there, and some of the problems with it and why people don't like it very much. So I do want to study a little bit with you what the Electoral College is, but the second thing I want to do is tell you a few stories from my experience as being one of California's 55 electors in the last presidential election in 2020. And there's a story to tell there about how states run their electoral colleges, how political parties play into that, how the heck I ended up being one of the 55 electors. Like, how did that happen? That seems kind of random. I share anyone's confusion about that. I was more confused than anybody when it happened. So I want to share that story with you. And nobody really asked for this, but forevermore, the Electoral College story will be tied together with the story of January 6, 2021. The insurrection, or as some people call it, the riot or the protest, was an explicit attempt to interrupt the ratification of the Electoral College vote that year, to overturn the election, essentially, and to stop then Vice President Mike Pence from performing his ordinarily sort of boring, mundane civil duty of putting his hand on the box of ballots, two of which inside were signed by me, and certifying the Electoral College. That had always gone on for 200 something years without incident until 2021, when there was an incident. So all three of these things are kind of on my mind today as we go through this. So I'll speak for about an hour, and we've reserved the last third of our gathering for a discussion. So any questions and comments you have, jot them down. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat, so because I can't talk and read at the same time. So if you have a question for me, just write it down somewhere, and we're going to get into it afterwards for sure. And I'm looking forward to all of your questions and comments. I'll start here. The most common question I ever get about the Electoral College is simply, how can we get rid of it? How do we get rid of this thing? And that sort of makes me laugh, because it's a great question, and it's hard. We were talking before the meeting started today even about that. What are the mechanisms by which we might abolish this strange 18th century thing that belongs time, another place, another context, and yet we are still like yoked with it? Maybe we can't change the Constitution, but maybe there are things states can do to amend the process. So that is, let me see if I can start sharing this. One moment while I find my PowerPoint. I made it go away by accident, so I'm going to open it back up. So I have a PowerPoint, of course, which is just going to help us kind of navigate the process a little bit better. And I'm about to pull it up and share it with all of you. Oh, while we're working on this, let me also add that I would be more than happy to email this PowerPoint presentation to any of you who would like to have it. That is easily done. All you have to do is write me an email. And the best way to do that is to go to my website, peterbolland.com. And there's a contact button there. Just hit that button. And when you're at peterbolland.com, you can drop me a little message, say, hey, could I have college PowerPoint? I'll email that back to you as soon as I get it, and give me a day or two there. So that's how that's going to work. Tony, maybe we could spotlight me, or pin me, or whatever we decided was the best way to do that.
I have you pinned, so on my screen it looks good.
Okay, good. Then I need to work on my screen a little bit. I'm still seeing too many tiles. Let's see
Let
if
me
I
try
can
a spotlight and see if I
figure that out.
try this.
Uh,
Is that any better?
yes, it is.
There we go.
Gracias. Okay, perfect. All right. So let me jump right in and kind of build the stage here with just a couple of quick kind of overviews and maybe a good way into the story. When the framers built the Constitution back in the 1780s, they were very concerned about mob rule. I think that was the thing that they feared the most. They knew they didn't want a monarchy, and there was debate, as many of you know, do we even want a president? Why can't we just have a couple of legislative houses and courts and kind of do without the whole single leader thing, the executive branch? It looked too much like a king to them, and how, about to enter into a revolutionary war process. That was something they were really trying to get away from. But they also were distrustful of, one person, one vote, kind of universal voting rights, because it was too easily manipulable. And all of these framers were great students of the classics. They all read Plato's Republic, and Plato's political philosophy in his classic book, The Republic, kind of warns about democracy a little bit. That it's kind of nice that it's trying to build consensus among a larger group of people instead of having one guy run everything. But the flaw with democracy, Plato argued 25 centuries ago in ancient Athens, was that most people don't think very clearly. They aren't rational. And I think we recognize that more than ever today, that people believe they are making decisions rationally based on argumentation and reasoned discernment of evidence. But I'm afraid most of us have reached the conclusion, especially in this election season, that many, many, many people make decisions from their gut, from their feelings, from emotions. So the framers, I think, were influenced by that sort of fear of democracy. So they wanted to build something in that would check that. Because they'd seen how quickly the worst base instincts can be inflamed by misinformation, passion, and propaganda. I know nothing like that's going on now, but but during this prototypical period at the very beginning of the colonies getting together to form a nation, they realized that the selection for president of the United States simply could not be left to the whimsical vagaries of public opinion. Public opinion is kind of a lousy barometer of what is true and what is just, they argued. Because people can be too easily misled by disinformation campaigns, even way back then. And I think we're all conscious of, in many ways, how it's so much worse now, coming from both within and outside the country. They talked about that, trying to build systems that prevented influence from powerful outsiders like France or England, of course, or influencers from the inside. So they created a tier of electors, later known as the Electoral College. This is the group of electors drawn from people outside the political class. So you can't be an elected politician and serve on the Electoral College. But they needed people who were informed, educated people, and they wanted the Electoral College to have no permanent status. It's an ephemeral thing that comes together for a couple of months and then it disbands. And then next presidential season, they'll form a new one, and that one will disband. They wanted it to come and go like that because they believed, therefore, it would be more immune to corruption and influence. And when I served as an elector, really no one even knew that I was doing it. A couple of enterprising journalists found me because, a few people were talking. It wasn't a secret, but I'm just some little nobody, right? Who's going to know that Peter Bolland is one of the electors? It's not printed in the paper or something, right? So a few people knew, and a couple people from some local journalism outlets got a hold of me. So the question I want to think about with you, were the framers' fears misplaced and groundless? It's kind of a rhetorical question because obviously there are a lot of people in the United States who are very influenced by misinformation campaigns, by strange claims. And this isn't a Democratic or Republican Party point. This is an observation about human nature, about sociology, and about political science in general. So, of course, on January 6, 2021, I know that calling it an insurrection is even a political statement now, isn't it? Because some people want to call it a riot. Some people call it a peaceful protest. And that's one of the things that happens when governments kind of fall apart is that different factions rename everything to suit their political perspective. So that's part of the struggle that we're in. So on that day, January 6th, I was home from my service as an elector in December of 2020. And I was watching TV on January 6th because I'm like, hey, I'm going to watch this boring thing on TV of when the joint meeting of the House and Senate and then Vice President Mike Pence goes through this kind of boring thing. So I thought I'd be watching C-SPAN, right? What network is going to cover this boring thing? So I'm watching this, and all of a sudden it's like, wait, there's a big crowd outside. Oh, they're breaking into the Capitol. And it's because at the time, former President Trump gave this speech right outside the elliptic there on the outside the White House and told his followers to go to the Capitol. And he said, I'm going to you. And as we know now from countless hours of testimony at the January 6th Commission, his Secret Service detail refused to drive him to the Capitol. And so he, in fact, did not go there. He went back into the tent and then he went to the White House and watched it unfold on TV as this increasingly large mob, over 1,000 people, a lot of Trump flags, this mock-up of a gallows. Doesn't look quite good enough to actually hang anybody, but it makes a really politically clear statement as the chants for hang Mike Pence went out. Then the mob broke into the Capitol. And then I'm sorry to take you all through this, but I want to set the stage. This is a couple of House members or senators running for their lives. And the Capitol Police did their best to defend the doors, barricade the doors. And as many of us know, there was a shooting as one of the officers shot a woman from San Diego, in fact, Ashley Babbitt, who was being pushed through a broken window into the lobby where the House chambers were. And a lot of House members and senators were hiding in their staff offices. Their staff were hiding. They thought they were going to be killed. I've talked to my Congresswoman, Sarah Jacobs. She was a brand new freshman House member, Congresswoman, taking Susan Davis's place in the district where I live, and she had been in the Capitol for 6 days when this happened, and it was a terrifying day, and where these people were making phone calls and saying goodbye to their loved ones, like those haunting phone calls from 9/11 of people in the tower. Maybe we've heard some of those recordings. Um, I think we've largely lost sight of the absolute terror that the people inside that building were experiencing. That there were violent members in that mob, maybe not all of them. Some of them were just kind of swept up in it, but there were violent members in that mob, with zip ties ready to tie up people and God knows what, right? So that threat to life is the context of the Electoral College. They were there. Former President Trump tweeted on December 12th, a few weeks earlier, January 6th, come to DC, will be wild. And Steve Bannon and a lot of evangelical movement leaders, Christian nationalist movement leaders, well-funded, rented hundreds of buses and drove a lot of people to carry on this protest. And I don't know what they all had in mind, but we all know kind of what happened. And so, with that context there, of a very real and concerted effort to interrupt the Electoral College certification, and as we know, some people call it a coup attempt to overturn the will of the people and to install a leader through congressional fiat, by sending, fake electors, as they're called, alternative electors. So we'll get into some of those bits and pieces, but before we do that, let's think back on what exactly the Electoral College is, how it started, and what its rationale is. Um, what is it? It is a curious compromise that nobody liked. Um, and we still don't really like it. It was written into the Constitution in 1787 as a compromise between two even less to them appealing options. One, let's let Congress pick the president, which is how a lot of governments in the world do it. Their parliament elected, House of Commons, House of Lords, or in other systems similar to that, I'm thinking of Israel or Germany, or the Netherlands, there is a big parliamentary system. And then a prime minister is sort of selected through a combination of legislative processes, popular vote, et cetera. But these founders thought, we don't want the legislative branch picking the executive branch. We want a separation of powers. The executive branch cannot be chosen by the legislators. Too much cronyism there. And the other option, and the one that I think a lot of us are kind of pining for, is why don't we just elect presidents by popular vote? Every other elected official in the United States, from dog catcher all the way to US Senate, is elected by a simple majority popular vote, except the president and vice president. And that's because way back when in the Constitution, they decided to do this strange Electoral College process. It's difficult to understand. We're going to make some progress, though. So today, there are 538 electors, and we'll talk about why that number and how that's determined. And maybe you do know this from following political news. A candidate for presidency, for example, many of us will be watching the news on Tuesday night in 12 days. And we'll be watching the Electoral College totals come in. And whoever gets to 271st, it's a lock. That's going to be our next president. That's the race, right? 270 is the magic 51% of 538. So there is one elector per congressional House district. So that's the linkage there. So a big state like California had, when I was an elector 4 years ago, there were 53 House districts. So we had one elector per House district, and then one per each of our two senators. So that's how we got to 55. Footnote here, since the 2020 election, California has lost a House district because our population went down. All of our friends moving to Idaho and Oregon and Arizona and everything. So California's population clicked down, and the most recent census showed that decline. So we lost a House seat because a House seat is granted to every cluster of 750,000 people, 750,000 people. So we went from 52 districts down to 51 plus two Senate. So now we're at I did that math wrong. Now we're at 54. We were at 55. Anyway, it's the number of electors is tied directly to how many House of Representative members you have. And as it is now, we have 52 House districts and then two senators. So today we have 54 electors. Again, back in the previous election, we had 55. Small matter. Now, I'm going to dive into some more details about how electors are chosen, and specifically how the heck did I end up in this role. We'll get into that a little later, and also each state does it a little differently. The Constitution, if you've read this passage, is really vague. It just leaves it up to the states. So we'll dive into that as well. Also, another interesting fact: at the time when the Constitution was being written, there really were no political parties. They just didn't exist. They sort of except in the shadows, there were like very loose affiliations of voters, but nothing like what we have now, where we have this really kind of rigid two-party system. That didn't exist back then. People were just Americans, and they had their opinions, but without the party system. So why is there an electoral college? Let's sort of address that question. Why did these fine folks decide to do that? I know this painting, isn't it? It's a classic sort of neoclassical, romantic, frankly propagandistic portrait of the founders. All these wealthy white men in a room with their powdered wigs, most of them, making, of course, only the most noblest and rational decisions for all of the rest of the people who weren't let into rooms like this. So, what were they thinking about the rationale behind this curious institution called the Electoral College? Well, as you recall from your history studies, that entire summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention from May 14th to September 17th in Philadelphia, in those sort of sweltering hot rooms, trying to figure out what the heck are we going to do to build a nation. And I don't know if you've read the Constitution lately. It's not always an easy read, but I recommend that you slog through it. It has an incredible elastic power and beauty. It's a pretty remarkable thing. It's far from perfect. As we all know, it's been amended through the years, especially right after the Civil War in 1865. Some really important changes like, oh, you probably shouldn't have slaves anymore. But at the beginning of the process, slavery, of course, was ignored in the Constitution, and more on that a little bit later. So the question that they were wrestling with was, okay, now that we've decided to have a president, how should we pick a president? And it's worth noting the historical context of 1787. It's an almost unrecognizable world vis-a-vis our own. It's a fundamentally, profoundly different place. 1 out of 6 people were allowed to vote, only property holding white males. So rich white men were the only people that were allowed to vote. No one was included or really even considered to be a part of the process. To run for office, you had to present your deeds of ownership of land to prove that you were wealthy to run for office, and voting was not that different. Here's another reason, or another historical context that kind of shaped why they decided that the Electoral College might be a good idea. Most Americans didn't know anything. They couldn't read. There was no universal educational, mandatory K through 12 education like our society. So people were, by and large, functionally illiterate, except for maybe more urban people, more upper class people who had access to school, who had the leisure to go to school. And so, what good they thought would having universal voting rights be, since most of the people don't know anything about politics or law or justice or large issues or foreign policy, or how to administer justice. And it would again, back to our earlier point, it would be a kind of, in their mind, a kind of mob rule of largely uninformed people. And that was to them just too dangerous of a way to select the president. There was, I guess, if I could state the obvious, no widespread access to journalism or political news. There's no daily newspapers going around everywhere. People printed pamphlets in the urban centers and passed them around, but most people couldn't read anyway. And so, where would you get your political information? And also this, in no other country at the time was there a popular election for its leader. No countries on earth had ever thought that this crazy idea of everybody voting for the leader would be a good idea. So my point is, it was untried and completely lunatic sounding to most of these folks. So what I hear a lot of people talking about today is, let's get rid of the Electoral College vote. Let's just go back to let's go to popular vote, the way we elect everybody else in our entire political system. Why don't we elect presidents that way? And those people who talk like that are mostly Democrats who are still mad about 2016, when Donald Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by about 3 million votes nationwide. But as you know, we do not elect presidents nationally. All elections are local, and they are all run by individual states, and in fact, by individual counties within those states. And Donald Trump was awarded the presidency because he hit 270 Electoral College votes before Hillary Clinton did, and he clinched it, and she was blocked out. So, depending on your feelings about the 2016 election, you might have some bitterness about the Electoral College process. And but if Trump is your guy, you're pretty happy. You're kind of okay with it, even though it is a form of minority rule. That's the big complaint about the Electoral College, is that it's fundamentally undemocratic. And we'll get into more details that shore up that claim in a moment. So to this day, by the way, the popular vote is rarely used anywhere in the world to elect a nation's president or prime minister. So you and I might wish for uh, a process by which we elect our presidents through the popular vote, but I wouldn't hold my breath, because, again, to change the Constitution is really, really hard. And the Electoral College is baked in to the Constitution from 1787. We've always elected presidents this strange way, this kind of nakedly elitist way. The framers, as I said before, also did not want Congress to choose the chief executive. Too much risk of cronyism. A group of legislators just picking one of their own to kind of go sit in the White House is like, no, no, no. We need separation of the legislative and the executive branch. And again, the popular vote was out of the question because they thought, and they wrote about this, that there's too much risk of a headstrong mob pushing through a tyranny. Tyranny aversion ran very strong. They were dealing with King George, a monarch. And they're like, no, we cannot get anywhere near anything that resembles tyranny. We need to have shared governance. We want to go by our 1776 document from 20 years earlier, the Declaration of Independence, that all of us have inalienable rights. And one of the rights we have is to establish the government, to uphold our individual rights. And as the Declaration also says, Thomas Jefferson's words, right? That the people have the right to abolish the government whenever it fails to uphold its principal role, namely upholding individual liberty not granted by a monarch, not granted by the state, but inalienable, granted by what Jefferson called nature's God. So rights, according to John Locke and Jefferson and a lot of the framers, come from the state, inherent in the fact that I exist, that you exist. We are born with rights. The sole role of the state is to support those rights. So 20 years later, when they're writing this Constitution, they want to make sure that we create a system that upholds individual liberty as much as possible. And as ironic as it kind of sounds on the surface, sometimes one person, one vote, or what they call mob rule, is the worst way to get to a system that shores up individual liberty when you have a leader being pushed through who is opposed to liberty. So, what to do? Alexander Hamilton, the guy they wrote the musical about, and James Madison pushed the idea of an ephemeral appointed group of intermediaries, the Electoral College. And you know who hates the Electoral College more than most of us? Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. they were they were just, I don't know. Have you ever served on a committee? I'm talking to a lot of you folks here. You're probably all on committees right now. Committees, God bless them, right? And I've been on a million too. Nobody gets what they want, but everybody collaboratively picks the least objectionable way forward that angers the least people and disappoints the least people. And so this is one of those examples where Hamilton and Madison, realizing they were stuck, we can't let the legislator pick the president. We can't do popular vote. What the heck are we going to do? Well, hey, I got an idea. Let's create this ephemeral body of electors who can be kind of a buffer between raw mob rule and the cronyism and corruption of having the legislature do it. I mean, popular vote's out of the question. Let's get that off the table. But the choice was between mostly the legislative appointment and this strange thing called the Electoral College. And they decided to put the Electoral College in there. And by the way, let me go back for a second. James Madison, as soon as it was ratified, he went to work to amend it, and he had all kinds of ideas about how to fix it, how to change it. Unfortunately, he died before any of those kind of made it through the amendment process. So we're stuck with pretty much the original form. However, as I mentioned before, the Constitution is pretty concise. It doesn't talk about how to actually manage the Electoral College. It says we'll let the states do that. So in all 50 states, and we're not going to get into all that, but it's done differently in different ways. And then a further complexity, along comes the political party process. And as we know now, the political parties kind of run the whole thing, and they run the Electoral College. So more on that in a moment. So there were no parties back then in 1787, 1789. The framers presumed that, isn't this nice and kind of optimistic and maybe you might say naive, um, hopeful anyway. The framers presumed that each elector would vote their conscience, and here's the confusing part to me: vote their conscience in line with the will of the local community that they represented. So each elector, again, represents a House district, a certain number of people back then. And so the elector's role was to be a rational, conscientious person who said to themselves, I'm here to represent the people I'm representing. I will take their popular vote in mind, and I will follow the will of those people. But there's also in Hamilton and Madison's mind this sense that the Electoral College would be a kind of barrier, a kind of firewall against kind of crazy mad mob rule. So I don't exactly know how this works either, and nobody does. It's just this strange thing, and the parties in all 50 states have tried to build a process around this that the Electoral College is just not robotically repeating the popular vote, but instead is a kind of buffer against the dangerous parts of mob rule. Now, when the parties rose to power, that all kind of got renegotiated. So this mechanism, though, the way that each House district picks an elector, has greatly affected the apportionment of both House legislators, and thereby the number of electors, right? Both, because again, for every House district, there's an elector. So in every state, there's a constant wrestling match between Republicans and Democrats to win those state house legislative roles so that they can create the congressional districts for the national legislative houses. I know it's getting a little complicated, isn't it? So today, the number is 750,000 people. There is a U.S. House of Representatives member, a House member, for every 750,000 people in a state. So some states like Alaska have one House member and two senators. And then a big state like California, we have 52, 53 congressional districts. So we have 52 or 53. It's gone down again. Electors. That's how we got to the 55 electors. Texas is another huge state. New York is a huge state. So, like the House of Representatives, electors exist in proportion to the population of a state, which makes the House, of course, as I think we understand intrinsically, the House of Representatives is the people's house. California has a lot of clout in the House because we have a lot of members there, and Alaska just has one. Senate is the countervailing body, right? Right down the hall on the other side of the building, there's the Senate. And tiny, tiny, tiny little states with no people have two senators. And California, with a gazillion people, has two senators. So, as a body, the United States Senate is overwhelmingly represented, represents rural areas, more conservative areas. And so, I don't know if you call it genius or what, but exist in a kind of permanent college as well, which is, as you are seeing, tied directly to the House and not the Senate. So each state is allotted one elector per House district plus one per senator. And the framers were really obsessed with state sovereignty. They left the details up to the states as to how electors were to be chosen or how they voted. Either that or they were just exhausted and couldn't figure it out. Like, we wrote the basic rule. Let's let the states figure out how it actually works and how they're going to choose electors and stuff like that. Now, here's a monkey wrench that I bet a lot of you are thinking about already. Kind of going to throw a wrench into the works here. Slaveholding states. Let's talk about Virginia, where Madison was from. In the state of Virginia, over half of the human beings in Virginia were enslaved people, owned by white people. Now it gets complicated. Do we count all the human beings when we are apportioning House members and therefore electors? And the northern states are like, no, you can't count enslaved people. And so now the bargaining started to happen. The only way that the founders could get these southern slaveholding states to join in the United States, to join in the Federation of Colonies, was to allow them to somehow count their enslaved population. And then here comes this sort of notorious, ugly number that every enslaved African American was going to be counted as 3/5 of a human being. And the slaveholding states were okay because that got them more representation in the House. It got them more electors. But it left an ugly stain on the Constitution, which allowed enslavement of human beings until we fought a little war, 100 years later, the Civil War, and then along came the amendments that outlawed slavery. So just to repeat the point, nobody loved the Electoral College, but it was better than all the alternatives. And we've been electing presidents this way for 233 years or 34 years, whatever that number is, over 200 years. It kind of reminds me of that Churchill line, oft repeated, and I hope it isn't apocryphal because it's a great line where he said, democracy is a terrible form of government, but it's better than all the others. And I think that's where they got with the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a terrible way to elect a president, but in their minds, it's better than all the alternatives. we'll circle back around and talk about some of the criticisms of the Electoral College because, as you have already realized, the America that we live in now is nothing like the 1780s. But let's kind of take a detour for a moment into the story of how I ended up being an elector and how does the Electoral College work in the states. So focusing mostly on our state, California. This photo is, of course, me and my friend and former student at Southwestern College when he was a kid, Amar Campa. And some of you may recall that he ran for Congress unsuccessfully in the 50th United States House Congressional District, and which is East County, right? And basically, imagine San Diego County, the whole eastern swath, like the backcountry and the rural areas, from El Centro to Ramona and up into Murrieta, and it grabs a little bit of Vista. So that East County kind of like block, it's a big piece of land, but population, of course, not near what the coastal areas are. So he was a student of mine, I think back in like 2010, 2011. And then after he went to San Diego State and he was studying political science, he volunteered for Obama's reelection campaign. Remember, Obama won in 2008, and then he was running again in 2012. And being an idealistic guy who kind of connected with Obama, kind of on a personal level, skinny brown guy with a funny name, as he often said on his own campaign trail. Um, he took Obama as a role model and thought, I'm gonna grab a clipboard and I'm gonna run for office like Obama told me to, and he decided to first volunteer for the Obama campaign in 2012. He ran the local office here in San Diego. Then he applied for a White House internship, and he was turned down 3 times, and he was accepted the fourth time. So in the spring of 2013, right after Obama was inaugurated the second time, my friend Amar Campa got to go to DC and work in the White House. Um, and it was just a dream, to be there with President Obama, Vice President Biden, and get to know both of them and be in the office with them. It was a real life-changing experience. And I stayed in touch with Amar on the phone a lot. We talked a lot, and his plan was always to come back to San Diego and give his life to some kind of public service. And when his internship ended at the White House, he took a job with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and got really involved in the Latino kind of business activist movement. That was a really important networking opportunity for him. And then he jumped over to the government side. He took a job at the Department of Labor, and he worked in communications in both of those jobs. So he became kind of a media communications expert, and that really equipped him well and to come back and run for Congress against Duncan Hunter. I kind of asked him at the time, like, "Are you crazy? This is a really red district. How is a Democrat gonna beat Duncan Hunter? The Duncan Hunter dynasty, father and son, had served 36 years as the congressional representatives of that district. How are we going to beat Duncan Hunter?" And then, of course, some things happen. You remember Duncan Hunter ended up going to jail. And but they brought in Darrell Issa, and Amar ended up losing to Darrell Issa. The two of them are still friends. Darrell Issa and Amar talk on the phone every week, so don't think of politics as some horrible hate fest. It's a good-natured competition. And so this photo is of Amar in our house. Lori and I hosted a fundraiser. We were doing everything we could to kind of help Amar along. And we had a fundraiser at our house, and that was really kind of a fun thing to do. And so there he is when he was running for Congress. So generally, back to the question on the top of the slide, how does the Electoral College work in the states? Well, generally now, because everything is run by Republicans and Democrats, they run the process. Who's ever kind of in power in that state. So if a Democratic candidate wins the presidency, the popular vote in California, which kind of is what always happens mostly, then the Democratic Party's electors are the ones that go to Sacramento to certify that vote. In other states where the Republican candidate for president wins, then the Republican Party's electors go to their state house and they ratify that vote. So it's the party itself and it's people like Amar who kind of run the process. So Amar basically called me one day. I was pulling into the supermarket to do some grocery shopping. My phone rings and I pick it up and it's Amar. And I go, hey, Amar. And he's all, hey, Peter, how'd you like to serve as an elector in the Electoral College? And I said, you mean that thing everybody hates? And he said, yeah, that. And I said, yes, I'm in. Because even though I'm not a fan of the Electoral College, how could I turn down this opportunity, right? Now, why was Amar given the role of picking an elector? That's the party process. He was the number one vote getter in the Democratic primary for the 50th district congressional seat, and the primary was in March or April or something of that year. And so they told him, "Hey, Amar, pick somebody to be the elector from from the district you're running in." So that's how it happened. It's pretty mundane. It's not because I had any special qualifications at all. In fact, I asked him, why'd you call me? Like everybody. And he said, oh, I just knew you'd really enjoy it. And he was right. I really enjoyed it. So that's the story. Now, just to fast forward, when I was in Sacramento in the legislative room there with the other 54 electors, many of them were just friends of the congressional winners in their districts, the Democratic Party Congress people in their districts. Sometimes it was often spouses. Yeah, my husband's the congressman, so he always just sends me. It's really that simple. It's just someone that the person knows, and so they reach out to them. So here's what is to me the kind of the most troubling part of this whole thing and why it's so fundamentally undemocratic. So back in 2020, let's go in the Wayback Machine to 4 years ago. The Biden-Harris ticket beat the Trump-Pence ticket. Trump was running for re-election, as you recall. He had been president from 2016 to 2020, and he was being challenged by Joe Biden with Kamala Harris as his running mate. And so the Biden-Harris ticket was up against the Trump-Pence ticket. Now in California, as many of us know, it's always kind of a Democratic blowout, 64% to 34%. Biden earned 64% of the vote. Trump earned 34% of the vote. Now, California, like 47 other states, is a winner-take-all state. All of the state's electoral college votes are awarded to the winner. So if you're kind of doing the math there are 48 states that are winner-take-all states. And these are state decisions where, because the Democratic candidate Biden beat the Republican candidate Trump, even though a third of us voted for Trump in 2020, like that, all of those Trump voters' votes got erased. And 100% of California's electors, and it's a big block, right? 55, it's huge. You only need 270 to win. All went to Joe Biden and his vice presidential running mate, Kamala Harris. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that feels profoundly undemocratic. In fact, since the Biden-Harris ticket won, the highest Democratic vote getter in all 53 of California's U.S. districts gets to choose an elector. And that's how we get to the Amar Camp-Najjar story. That's which I've already shared with you. That's how that happened. So then I get this piece of paper from the Secretary of State at the time, Alex Padilla. Basically, Omar's campaign office, he had his staff call the Secretary of State, say, yeah, it's Peter Bolland. Here's his details. I filled out a form. I get this cool looking thing in the mail from Alex Padilla, who was then our Secretary of State. I think he's senator now. This gets us to this point, which is probably where a lot of us are in our minds, like, wait a minute, this sounds weird. This sounds wrong. The world has dramatically changed since 1787. So why do we still elect presidents the same way? We don't have the illiteracy problem anymore. We have mandatory K through 12 education. Literacy is nearly universal compared to then. We have media access. On my phone, I have access to the most brilliant historical and political journalism and analysis and scholarly articles as much as I want. And of course, millions of conspiracy theory websites. It's a big hot mess right here, right? But we have access to information that they could never even dream of. We have global communication. Um, and so we've overcome a lot of the limitations just through social evolution that led Madison and Hamilton to insist that there be this sort of elite cabal of people to defend us against mob rule. That doesn't mean mob rule and misinformation is not a problem anymore. Maybe it's a bigger problem than ever, but that's one thing that's no longer the same. And it's just seems weird that all of our elected officials are elected by popular vote except these two. It doesn't seem tenable or rational. And that it is, and I think this is people's biggest complaint, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, that it's fundamentally at a principle level undemocratic. Just look at how 34% of Californians who voted for Trump had zero voice in California's massive vote for president. In other words, 34% of the population of California is 7.5 million people, mostly in the Central Valley, by the way, but sprinkled everywhere. I just drove home from Yosemite yesterday. My wife and I were up in Yosemite for the last 6 nights. And I spent all day yesterday driving home through all these winding roads in the Central Valley and then down to 99 South. And oh my gosh, so many Trump signs, entire barns painted with, Trump Vance signs, billboards, and everything. The Central Valley is where you're going to get a lot of support for Trump. And that's where Devin Nunes is from. That's where Kevin McCarthy is from, Bakersfield, Fresno, where the Dust Bowl kind of blew out and landed. And it's agricultural. That's how everybody makes money, either farming or in a business that supports farming. It's the fundamental industry. I wonder what they're going to do when 20 million immigrants get deported and the entire agricultural system collapses. Anyway, I editorialize, but let me back into what we were just thinking about. So since the apportionment of electors is tied directly to congressional House districts, the whole system now is vulnerable to gerrymandering. You were probably wondering when that term was going to come up. Gerrymandering, instead of drawing U.S. House districts in a kind of reasonable way around population groups, as we know, state legislators draw those districts largely, and they create these amoeba-looking things with long arms that go out and circle around a neighborhood you don't want in your district and go out and grab, the white suburbs or whatever. So in this way, and both parties participated in this, but it's been particularly effective in GOP hands lately. And because House districts are everything. That's where your power lies, in how many House districts you can get out of your state that are on your political party's side. So there are states like Michigan that have a majority of Democrats in the population, but have a majority of Republican House members in their state houses because they've drawn the districts. So that's a minority rule argument. And some people are in favor of that because they want to be in control and they want power. But to some of us in our sort of schoolhouse sense of justice, it's like that just isn't fair. The people that have the most votes should have the most power. I thought that's how it worked, but it kind of doesn't work that way because people have learned how to kind of work with these systems. So lately, however, since most states are run by Republican state houses, which have the power to draw these federal congressional districts, some fundamentally undemocratic processes are taking shape, like the one I just mentioned to you. Now, there are a few states like Wisconsin, for example, where Democrats outnumber Republicans, like the example I was just citing you before, by a pretty weirdly substantial margin. But because of gerrymandering, again, Republicans hold a majority of seats in their state houses, thereby creating minority rule. So these are some of the challenges around the Electoral College that make people want to just wash their hands of it, get it out of here. We don't need it. It's fundamentally unfair. And people of both parties have complained about this. But frankly, it has benefited one of the two parties more than the other quite a bit lately. I already mentioned the Hillary Clinton Trump example, to the point where two states, I mentioned the 48 before, the two other states, Nebraska and Maine, have decided at the state level to kind of manage the whole thing differently and not be a winner take all state. And what they do, and I won't get too far in the weeds here there, but they have kind of an apportionment process. So, for example, let's pretend California is not a winner take all state, and we have 55 electors, and 60% of the vote goes for the Democrat, 40% goes for the Republicans. And so we would simply divide the electors that way. 60% of the electors cast your vote for the Democrat, 40% of the electors cast your vote for the Republican. That's one way to short circuit the Electoral College. And then people might ask, well, if we're going to do that, why have an Electoral College? Well, the reason is because it's so hard to change the Constitution, but states can make these kinds of rules. But you know what? Why? Think about it. Why would the Democratic Party in California want to give any votes to the Republican getter? This winner take all thing works for Democrats in California. It works for Democrats in New York. They get more power from the winner take all model. And so they do the math and they're like, you know what? We're kind of okay with this. We'll work with this. So these are some of the dynamics that really make the Electoral College super confusing. And some of you have already voted. My wife and I sent in our ballots a couple days ago. Some of you are yet to vote in the next 12 days. Why even vote for president? I mean, all the other elections are much more powerfully important, but it's sort of a fait accompli that I think it's safe to say Harris is going to win California by a mile, by many miles. And then she's going to get all the Electoral College votes. So why would I even cast a vote for president in a place like California? Well, I think there's a strong reason why, and that is whatever party or side you're on, you want to see your candidate rising in the popular vote nationally, because you want that on the political record, that your candidate, like in the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump example in 2016, that your candidate actually won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. It's good to have those numbers in place. So everybody should vote for president, whichever one you like, so that your candidate gets as far as possible in the national popular vote, even though that's not how we pick presidents. It's still an important record, isn't it? It's an important snapshot of the mind of the American people. So let me pivot to just a brief story about my day. On December 13th, 2020, I flew to Sacramento. And because it says in the Constitution that on the first Monday after the second Tuesday or something, that's when the Electoral College will meet. So in 2020, it was December 14th. So I got a Southwest flight up there the night before. I wanted to, check in. And some of y'all remember, of course, exactly what was going on in the winter of 2020. This was the depths of COVID chaos. This was the most severe restriction. I couldn't get an airline ticket without proving that I was not traveling for pleasure. I was traveling for business. The airports were empty. The planes were empty. This is when we were all locking down in our houses and wiping down all of our groceries with swabs or getting it delivered. This is where we were wearing masks everywhere. I was no longer teaching at my college. We'd all been sent home the previous March of 2020. They closed the campus. We were all Zooming from then on. So this is in December of that year. We just had the election in November. And maybe that's one of the reasons that Biden won. But it appeared that Biden won. But it's not official until the Electoral College votes are ratified. And people were doing the math and declaring Biden the winner, but it wasn't official till we cast our votes that Monday in December. So I checked into the Citizen Hotel. There's a picture of it. It's 3 blocks from the state capitol. As I was planning my trip, I'm online. I'm Googling hotels in downtown Sacramento. I'm like, oh, this one's called the Citizen Hotel. I like that. That's nice because I'm going to go up there and be a citizen. That was my rationale for picking it. It was empty. The kitchen was closed. The restaurant was closed. The only food you could get were like breakfast burritos in like a plastic clamshell that they were making somewhere in the hotel. So it was a weird time. If any of you traveled, you know what I mean. So I walked the 3 blocks to the Capitol. I had this beautiful hotel to myself, this charming Christmas tree. Didn't feel very Christmassy. It was all sort of haunting. It was sort of post-apocalyptic, like, where is everybody? Did the rapture happen and I didn't get to go? It was a strange time to be out and about. Then I walked to the state capitol. It was a beautiful, cold, crisp day, and I got ready to go inside. I got there super early, of course. This is the north entrance where we all had to go through. You recognize some of that, little covered areas, everybody's masked up. You kind of gel down and they check your temperature and they look at you. It's like you go through this medical thing. There's high security, as many of you know. The security at all state government buildings is run by the California Highway Patrol. So they were there. Once we got in the building, we rode up the elevator one by one. I'm clicking pictures. I'm really enjoying the ride. Attorney General's office right there. That's where Attorney General Kamala Harris was before she started running, before she was a senator, before she started running as Biden's running mate. There's the state library, beautiful painting of Yosemite. I'm just clicking pictures. This is the rotunda in the center. Just really a kind of a, you get a vibe from this place. I know a lot of you have been to the state capitol building and the US Capitol building. They're sort of similar, right? This one's a little smaller. And looking up from where I just was into the sky, into the rotunda. This is the inside of the hemisphere of the rotunda. And just if I could kind of humanities professor wonk out here for a second, rotundas as an architectural feature are beautiful and deeply symbolically, philosophically significant. They're all, of course, based on the paradigmatic building in Rome called the Parthenon from Roman times. And that perfect hemisphere, that perfect half circle dome, and there's an opening to the sky. And for the ancient classical people, this was an architectural structure that reflected Platonic philosophy, that there is an upper realm of pure forms, the ideal of justice, the ideal of goodness, pure truth, and that it was through this architectural opening, the dome under which human beings at their best endeavor to articulate the truth, to use their rational discourse, to join together with other people of good faith to create solutions to real world problems. I know it all sounds so beautifully aspirational, but the architecture screams all of that. That to be in this place, I got to tell you, as an elector walking into this nearly empty building with just, 50 something other people was a profoundly emotional experience. And to walk into this room, this is the great room where the House meets, the California State Assembly. And there's a portrait of Abraham Lincoln up there. And I walk up to my desk. I could tell it was my desk because it said California 50. That's my district that I was representing because Amar sent me. And there's a bunch of papers there. And I got there early. You can see most people aren't there yet. And that was the desk that I sat at for 2.5, 3 hours as we went through a whole series of kind of formal events. And you can see in the back there on that back wall, some looks like black windows. There were TV cameras back there, I later found out, because when we voted, as we voted, and there was a straw, there was a verbal vote, and it was clear that we all knew what the outcome was going to be when we walked in there because we went there to vote for Biden and Harris. But when we passed our vote and the gavel went down, and people just stood up and yelled. They stood up and cheered because California was one of the last states to ratify, and we put the Biden-Harris ticket up over the 270 mark. And my phone started blowing up because everybody at home watching on CNN, on Fox, on MSNBC said, "You're on TV, Peter, you're on TV." Those TV cameras were sharing that feed with the national media at the news that the presidency of Donald Trump had formally come to an end, and that the Biden-Harris ticket had been triumphant according to the Electoral College. So I couldn't believe it that I got to be in the room for that moment. It was incredible. Just a quick look at the things that I was looking at and the oath that I took. I'll read it out loud. This is the same oath that every elected official takes. the same one that federal officials take without the California lines. I've taken it twice in my life. Once when I was hired as a professor at the Southwestern Community College District, I had to go to the Chula Vista Police Department and take this oath with my hand up. And I did it again that day with these folks. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter. And when you say that out loud with a room full of people in a sacred place like that, with the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, looking down at you, everybody's favorite president, it's a religious experience. It really was. It's difficult to explain. And then that's just sort of the menu of the program of the things we were going to do. And then we're given some of the papers we had on our desk were this: 2 blank ballots, one for Joseph R. Biden of Delaware, one for Kamala D. Harris of California. And at one point we were instructed, okay, go ahead and sign your name at the bottom here. And we signed our name at the bottom here. And at this point, you might have a question. What if somebody decides they want to vote for Trump? Well, good question, but that person wouldn't have gotten in the room because they wouldn't have been chosen by the Democratic representative unless they were trying to sneak in or something, you know. And then what they would do is they would just tear that ballot up and they'd get somebody else. Here, you sit here and do it. So the outcome is a fait accompli, and that's what also feels sort of weirdly undemocratic about it, and frankly unnecessary about it. That it's a weird, like, secular ritual that I am simply there representing symbolically the 750,000 people of the 50th district. And in a winner take all state, every elector is going to vote for Biden Harris, and only Democratic electors are going to go to the Capitol that day. If Trump had won, then all the Republican electors would have gone to the Capitol that day. But that's not how it worked. So took one last look around at this beautiful space, walked outside to the second floor balcony, this incredible checkerboard thing. I got on one of these planes. I was home for dinner that night in San Diego. I'm showing you a picture of my backyard. I'll explain why. It's like a real estate shop. No, my home is not for sale. And by the way, having a pool was the last thing Lori and I wanted when we went home hunting back in 2003. We specifically did not want a pool. But this house checked all of our boxes and it had a pool. So we're like, okay, I guess we're gonna have a pool. And I got to tell you, on the hot days, it's kind of nice. But we inherited a pool maintenance company. Mostly I take care of it myself, but once a month, a guy comes by who actually knows what he's doing. And certain times of year, especially, that's helpful. So our pool company was called Fowler's Pools. And a couple of nice older guys, they were terrific. And about 5 years later, after we bought the house, maybe 2008 or something, they retired and they sold the company to this nice young married couple. And so a husband and wife and the husband's brother. And the three of them ran the company. They kept the name. And I met them and they were all great people. And the woman kind of ran the office, and I spoke with her on the phone many times, and we emailed and kind of set up the contract. And so I'm bringing that up because the 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 woman who died at the Capitol, the woman who was shot and killed, her name was Ashley Babbitt. She was my pool lady. Her and her husband owned the pool maintenance company. So I knew Ashley Babbitt. That's another reason why I'm telling the story in the way I'm telling it. I feel like I didn't choose any of this, but I feel like I got brought into the January 6th story in a really vivid way that kind of, whenever I tell the story, it still blows my mind that it all went down this way. Ashley Babbitt was an incredibly interesting and complicated character. She went to Washington on January 6th because she was an ardent Trump supporter, but she hadn't always been. In fact, she voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and in 2012. She was 34 years old that day. She was shot by a Capitol police officer as she was being pushed through a broken window by rioters behind her. She was the first person through into into the House lobby, and that was a line that the police officers were defending with guns, and they shot her right here in the shoulder. And I've seen the cell phone footage, maybe you have too, where she just falls back and she lays on the floor. It's kind of a blank look on her face. She apparently died very quickly. When I was watching the news on January 6th, all I saw was a stretcher going behind the camera outside the Capitol. And later that night, or maybe the next morning, I learned that it was Ashley Babbitt. And I couldn't believe my ears. And then the news stories started coming out about how this woman, again, a Democrat voter for years, a 14-year Air Force veteran, served honorably discharged. She served mostly as a sentry, as a military police officer, guarding gates for the Air Force. How ironic. And she goes to the Capitol. Now, the digital evidence is that she became increasingly radicalized. There's a lot of cell phone footage of her yelling into her phone as she's driving around San Diego about these dangerous immigrants, about how evil Governor Newsom is, about how great Donald Trump is. She became radicalized into the MAGA movement and finally even into the QAnon conspiracy theory. And this is what led her to go to Washington and sacrifice her life. And you hear former President Trump mentioning her name. She's a kind of martyr now to the MAGA right. And her husband is a cause celeb, and you know, is on podcasts with Trump and stuff. So I bring all that up because it gets us to our sort of final question. Then let's open it up in the Q&A. Sorry, I went over a little bit, but this question of now, what do we do? How do we kind of get from where we are now to where I think we all want to go, which is to a sane America? And I'll turn it over now to, I don't know if you want to moderate this, Tony, or you can stop. Maybe I'll unpin myself and we'll just go back to the group. Do you want to use the hand raising thing feature, or do you want to? How many people do we have? 25. Do we all fit on one screen? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Looks like we all fit on one screen, so people can just raise their hands. How do you want to do it, Tony?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if people want to raise their hands, that'll give us a cue and a sense of how many questions we have. We have about 17 minutes for questions, so I'll ask people to raise their hands if they know how to do it. If nobody's in the queue and you just unmute, that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like Todd has a question.
Hey, Peter.
Hi,
Can you hear
Todd.
me?
Yeah.
All right. So a couple of things. One of the things that you talked about, the Maine and Nebraska, when they separate the votes, it's each congressional district. If they vote for a candidate, that elector then goes to that candidate, and then the 2 extra votes go to whoever wins the overall vote within the state. So in some ways, it's still the same sort of a thing, but it's mitigated by separating it within congressional districts. And then the other aspect is, of course, if they are gerrymandered, then everything goes out the window anyway. So you still have the same problem or a similar problem anyway.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's good detail. Yeah, it's, you know, what do you think, Todd? Do you think it would be better if all 50 states did it that way? Or where would that get us?
Well, uh, good question. I don't know that it would get us anywhere, but you know what? We often give up the idea of experimenting and trying things to see how it works. And that's what I'm in favor of, doing something like that. If it doesn't work, you know what? We change it again, hopefully. Anyway. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention, Peter, and I'll shut up after that, is that, you know, the Senate is, and you indicated this to some degree, is very much a a minority rule chamber, because if you take the 25 lowest population states, they are 16% of the population, and yet they control 50% of the Senate. And if you bump that up to the 40 lowest population states, that's 80% of the Senate, but only 45% of the total population of the United States.
Thanks for those
So
numbers. Yeah, it's a kind of grim picture to those of us,
it is, yeah.
who came up with this naive view that America is all about being fair and square. Again, I think the installation of the Senate as a counterbody to the House was one of the compromises they made
Yeah,
in the early
it
days
was.
to get these tiny, tiny rural colonies to join on. Like, how am I going to not get crushed by New York? And they're like, well, we'll give you two senators. And like, okay. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was one of those deals for sure.
Yeah, you had four states that had major urban populations, and the other nine colonies or now states were concerned about them running over everything that they wanted to do. So yeah, it was a compromise.
Think how powerful Mitch McConnell is from the tiny state of Kentucky. And a couple 100,000 people put that guy in the Senate, and now he's been running the Senate, blocking Obama's Supreme Court nominees, pushing through Trump's three Supreme Court nominees, overturning Roe v. Wade. This is one dude from a tiny state
Right.
orchestrated all of this and is very proud of his heritage, kind of running the Republican Party as the majority of the House leader. So yeah, the Senate's a big deal, and it's part of our story here tonight for sure. Who else wants to jump in? Mike and Penny, go ahead, please.
Michael?
It is.
Okay. Hi, Peter. Good to hear from you again.
Thank you.
With a kind of theoretical question. I'm glad that Mike Pence did what he did, but did he have the authority to do what Trump asked him to do legally?
Yeah, that's above my pay grade. I've read about that a lot, and I trust the understanding that has taken shape in my mind from the sources I trust the most is no. And maybe you know that Mike Pence called Dan Quayle of all people, and as a former vice president, and Dan Quayle told him, no, you cannot do this. I know that Trump is asking you to do this. You can't. That's not how it works. You're the vice president. You are a ceremonial leader.
Right.
You don't have the discernment power to say, you know what, there's too many unregularities. I'm not going to certify today. We're going to turn it over to the House, and start that whole process. Trump was getting that legal advice from a bunch of people who are now in jail, but that is not something that Mike Pence wanted to do or thought was legal, and I tend to agree with Pence's read. But again, I'm no expert on that particular. There's so many moments, aren't there, that end up being super pivotal. Like, what if Pence had done that? What if they'd actually broken in and they were 30 seconds away from where Pence was hiding? What if they had gotten a hold of him and actually killed him? What kind of conversation would we be having after that? So I don't know. There's so many. I'm afraid we live in interesting times, as the old curse goes. Jan and Kathleen, please.
Hi, so I'm just curious about the ceremonial role that the vice president plays when the vice president is candidate for president. So,
Yeah.
will Kamala Harris preside over the electoral count? And I haven't done a lot of research on that, but I'm not finding any clear. She's still the vice president until January 20th, Martin Luther King Day, January 20th at noon or 11:59. So do you think she'll still preside over that even as she is on the ballot?
What a great question, and a fascinating scenario. I think my sense of it is that you're not vice president and president at the same time. So there is a distinct demarcation line between January 6th and January 20th. If Vice President Harris becomes president, she will be inaugurated on the 20th, and so she won't be president. She will be on January 6th. She will be vice president under the Biden administration and will still perform, in my sense of it, just the ordinary vice presidential rule, even though she'd be ratifying her own victory, and that's kind of weird. But is this the first time a vice president has become president if she does get elected? I don't think so. There's other examples of that, right?
Yeah, I
The
think there
vice,
are six others. They don't come to
I
mind.
can't rattle them off, but yeah,
Yeah. Um,
The first Bush.
yeah. The first Bush, right? Exactly.
So the Miami Herald, if that carries any weight, says that she'll preside over the certification.
Who else? I mean, it's the vice president constitutionally. So yeah, yeah. Interesting. Thanks for bringing that up.
Sam, did you want to ask the questions you put in the chat?
Oh yeah, I'm not looking at the chat because I'm not very good at multitasking. So
Can you hear me now and see me? Hi.
yeah,
Thanks
hi
for
Sam.
Hi. Thanks for putting everything together. So my question is a little bit different than everyone else's. And those documents, like what Madison actually listed and wrote, and was thinking about how to, I think you said just change the Electoral College, tweak it, make it better. So I'm wondering if those are in existence somewhere. Where are they housed, and do we have access to them? I'm really curious about that. That's one of my
Yeah.
questions. The other one is a tech. Those are two of the questions. The other is a tech question because your sound is very crisp and clear. And whenever I can get back to doing events and hosting events, I would like to know, like, what mic are you using and what sound setup? What kind is
Yeah.
that?
This is $100 mic. I got it. It's called a Blue. I think during COVID you couldn't find them anywhere, so I actually bought it from Walmart.com because I'm like, I need to get one of these. So these are really common mics used by podcasters. It plugs into a USB port on my I'm just using my HP laptop. So I'm not doing any preamps, or I'm not a producer. I don't know how to do any of that stuff, but but the mic on our laptops is terrible. And if you get just a decent mic like this, all of a sudden it sounds 100 times better. So
Yes.
that's the only investment I made. So thanks for that tech question.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, thanks, because I know that can be hard. And then sometimes when people can't hear you, but that I felt like that mic didn't cut out and it was crisp and clear. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, the other since a lot of you were Zoomers as well, the other tech thing I do so I don't cut out is I don't use Wi-Fi. I'm not on Wi-Fi right now. Wi-Fi is really terrible uploading speed. It downloads stuff pretty quick so you can watch Netflix, but it doesn't upload very good. And I'm uploading video, right? So I'm plugged into the Ether. I got a big Ethernet cable that I'm plugged into the Ethernet port directly from my modem. So that's more tech than y'all wanted to hear. But just to let you know, my video is going to be better because of the Ethernet cable and not using Wi-Fi, and the audio is better because of the mic. But those are the only two things. Back to your question about Madison. I don't have footnotes or citations. I was reading historical texts that referenced these works, so I don't have a site to send you to. But I think it would be easily found if you just started Googling Madison Electoral College, Madison's reservations, or his thoughts on amending it. I think you would find some of the things that he was thinking about. But he's a Virginian, right? And a lot of these guys were slavers, and so they owned enslaved people, and so that's the hard reality of kind of reflecting on the quote unquote wisdom of their founders. It's the complexity of the human condition, that these are people who, according to our way of thinking, are exist in a pretty horrific mode of consciousness, of conquest, of white supremacy. And it's you kind of have to sort through a lot of chaff to find the wheat. But on this particular point of making the Electoral College more fair, apparently he was trying to move in the right direction there. But I don't have specifics on that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Of
Appreciate
course.
it.
No, and thank you for your land acknowledgements in the chat. Beautiful.
Yeah, I put resources in too. And if it's okay, I didn't want to interrupt, but if it's okay, I'll put also another event that's coming up, which is an Indigenous Sustainability Conference during Native American Heritage Month. Okay, I'll put that in so folks can check it out.
Put anything you want in the chat. That's a good resource, whoever wants that.
Yes,
Thank you. And the only last question I had is if you'll give us a link so we can watch this again, because I joined late. If you could possibly like send a link to Tony to
Yeah,
send to
I'll
him.
leave that to Tony. I think Tony was going to make the recording of the Zoom available to anybody who's registered for it, which would be you, obviously, and everybody else. And so, Tony, how does that actually physically work?
that is a perfect
Thank
transition.
you.
If I can jump in to wrap up. So first, Peter, thank you so much. It is always a pleasure, always extremely informative.
My honor.
And we just love to have you. Thank you all for joining us. I will be sending out the video link in a few days. It will be a private YouTube video, so we ask you to please don't share that publicly with people. It's just for those people who have registered and want to re-listen, or those who weren't here tonight and wanted to listen to it again. The sustainability event that Sam mentioned is also there is a flyer on our Facebook page that with all those details too. So if you miss it in the chat, you can also check our community page on Facebook, First U San Diego, and we have that information there as well. And we hope to see you all next time, which has not been scheduled yet, but you will all get an email from either me or Jan, probably both of us, when that November event is scheduled. And with that, I thank you all again, and I will extinguish our chalice.
Sorry, Tony, before you just, can I just mention again, peterbolland.com. I just want to reiterate, if you would like the slides that I used today to be emailed to you as a PDF, as a document, I'm more than happy to do that. Just go to my website, peterbolland.com, and ask me there on the contact page. So there you go.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. So as we extinguish this chalice, may its light continue burning as a beacon of liberty and justice, leading us ever closer to our goal of co-creating a beloved community. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you all next time.
Good night, everybody.
Amen. Thank
Amen.
Good night.